I'm Admiral Victoria Hayes, and when I found my 8-year-old son Dylan collapsed on our front porch during Hurricane Iris, his lips blue from hypothermia and his school backpack still clinging to his shoulders, I knew someone was going to pay. What I didn't know was that the person responsible was sitting in my own living room, sipping coffee and telling me it was all his fault for being too slow. My sister Natalie had just signed her own federal prison sentence, and she had no idea the storm she was about to face was far worse than the one that nearly killed my boy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency alert on my phone screamed at 3:47 p.m. that Tuesday afternoon. Hurricane Iris had shifted course, and Port Clearwater was now directly in the storm's path. Winds were already reaching 60 miles per hour, and the National Weather Service was calling it a life-threatening situation. As the commanding officer of Lighthouse Point Coast Guard Station, I had protocols to follow, rescue teams to coordinate, and a community to protect. What I should not have been worried about was my son's safety, because he was supposed to be safe at Anchor Bay Elementary until I could pick him up after the storm passed. That's what my sister Natalie had promised me 3 days earlier, when she'd volunteered to handle school pickup duties while I managed the emergency response. She'd rolled her eyes at my detailed instructions about storm protocols, waved off my concerns about the weather reports, and assured me she had everything under control. Natalie had always been the dramatic one in our family, the one who turned minor inconveniences into personal tragedies, but she'd also been reliable when it came to Dylan. At least, I thought she had been. The storm hit Port Clearwater like a freight train made of water and wind. From my station overlooking the harbor, I watched fishing boats strain against their moorings, saw traffic lights swing violently on their cables, and coordinated the evacuation of 3 families from Bayview Avenue whose basement was flooding. My radio crackled with reports of downed power lines, blocked roads, and stranded motorists. This was the kind of storm that killed people, the kind that turned familiar streets into rushing rivers and ordinary objects into deadly projectiles. At 4:15 p.m., I tried calling Natalie to confirm Dylan was safe at school. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again at 4:30, then 4:45. Nothing. The knot in my stomach began to tighten. But I told myself she was probably helping with the after-school program, keeping kids calm while they waited for parents to navigate the increasingly dangerous roads. Natalie could be scattered, but she wouldn't put Dylan at risk. She couldn't be that irresponsible. Lieutenant Sophia Garrett found me staring at my phone at 5:20 p.m., still trying to reach my sister. Sophia had been my second in command for 3 years, and she could read my expressions better than most people could read books. The worry must have been written across my face in bold letters, because she immediately asked if everything was okay with Dylan. Natalie was supposed to pick him up from school, I said, my voice steady despite the growing anxiety. She's not answering her phone. Sophia glanced at the weather radar on her tablet, the massive red spiral of Hurricane Iris covering half the state. Roads are getting bad out there, Admiral. Maybe they're just waiting it out at the school. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. But something felt wrong, and after 22 years in the Coast Guard, I'd learned to trust my instincts. I called Anchor Bay Elementary directly, and the automated message informed me that the school had closed at 2:30 p.m. due to weather conditions, with all remaining students released to authorized guardians. Released to authorized guardians. That meant Dylan should have been with Natalie for over 2 hours. The next call I made was to Mrs. Helen Kozlov, our 70-year-old neighbor, who had lived on Bayview Avenue longer than anyone and kept track of the neighborhood like it was her personal responsibility. Mrs. Kozlov answered on the second ring, her voice nearly drowned out by the howling wind outside. "Victoria, dear, I was just about to call you," she said, and my blood turned to ice water. "I saw Dylan walking down the street about 20 minutes ago. Poor child was soaked to the bone and struggling against the wind. I would have brought him inside, but by the time I got my coat on, he'd made it to your house." Walking down the street. In Hurricane Iris, my 8-year-old son had been walking home alone in conditions that were dangerous for adults. I was off the phone and in my truck before Mrs. Kozlov finished her sentence, ignoring Sophia's protests about driving in the storm. The 2-mile drive from the station to my house normally took 5 minutes. That day, fighting against wind gusts that rocked my vehicle and navigating around fallen branches and debris, it took nearly 20. I found Dylan on our covered front porch, curled up against the door like a wounded animal. His school clothes were plastered to his small frame, his dark hair matted against his skull, and his lips had that bluish tint that every parent nightmares about. He was conscious but shivering so violently he couldn't speak clearly. I scooped him up, feeling how cold his skin was even through his wet clothes, and carried him inside while calling 911 on my cell phone. "Dylan, baby, what happened?" I asked while stripping off his soaked jacket and wrapping him in the warmest blanket I could find. "Where's Aunt Natalie?" He looked up at me with eyes that seemed too old for his face and whispered, "She said I was being a baby. She said real boys don't need rides when it's just a little rain. Just a little rain." Hurricane Iris was ripping roofs off houses 3 blocks away, and my sister had called it a little rain. But Dylan wasn't finished with his explanation, and what he said next made me understand that this wasn't just negligence or poor judgment. This was something much worse. "She was mad because I asked if we could wait for you to pick me up," Dylan continued, his voice getting stronger as he warmed up. "She said you think you're so important with your uniform and your big job, but she's not a babysitter, and she's not waiting around all day for the drama queen Admiral to make time for her own kid. She said if I wanted to go home so bad I could walk, and maybe next time I'd appreciate the rides she gives me." The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later and confirmed what I already knew. Dylan was suffering from mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but he was going to be okay. They recommended a trip to Seaside Medical Center for observation, which meant I spent the next 4 hours in a hospital room watching my son sleep while Hurricane Iris continued to batter the coast outside. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the pediatric physician on duty, assured me that Dylan would recover completely, but she also made it clear that 20 more minutes in those conditions could have been catastrophic. While Dylan slept, I made phone calls. I called my station to update Sophia on my status and learned that the storm had claimed 2 lives already. An elderly man whose car had been swept off a flooded road, and a teenager who'd been struck by a falling power line while trying to secure patio furniture. I called my insurance company to report a claim for my son's medical treatment. And I called my sister. Natalie answered on the 4th ring, her voice bright and cheerful like she was calling to chat about weekend plans. "Hey, Tori, how's the storm treating you guys? I bet you're loving all the drama and excitement." "Dylan's in the hospital," I said, my voice flat and controlled. There was a pause, then a nervous laugh. "What? Why? Is he okay?" "He has hypothermia because you made him walk home in a hurricane." Another pause, longer this time. When Natalie spoke again, her tone had shifted to defensive irritation. "Oh, come on, Tori. It wasn't a hurricane when he left school. It was just windy and a little wet. Kids these days are so soft. When we were little, we walked to school in all kinds of weather, and nobody made a federal case out of it." I looked at my sleeping son, at the monitors tracking his vital signs, at the IV drip helping his body recover from what could have been a deadly experience. "A federal case," I repeated slowly. "That's an interesting choice of words, Natalie. You know what I mean. You're being dramatic, just like always. Dylan's fine, isn't he? A little water never hurt anybody. Maybe this will teach him not to be such a whiny baby when things get a little uncomfortable." That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. Natalie had deliberately endangered my son because she was angry at me, and she felt no remorse about it. She was sitting in her warm, dry house, completely unaware that Dylan could have died, and she was lecturing me about being dramatic. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "At home, obviously. Where else would I be in this weather? I'm not stupid enough to drive around in a storm, unlike some people." I hung up without saying goodbye and sat back in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching my son's chest rise and fall. The IV bag dripped steadily, each drop representing another moment he was getting healthier, another step away from the hypothermia that could have killed him. Outside the hospital window, Hurricane Iris was beginning to weaken, But the damage was already done. To my son, to my trust, and to my relationship with my sister. At 11:30 p.m., Dylan woke up asking for water and mac and cheese, which Dr. Vasquez said were excellent signs. His color had returned to normal, his shivering had stopped, and his temperature was back in the safe range. He would be discharged in the morning with instructions for rest and monitoring, but he was going to be completely fine. Physically, anyway. "Mom?" he said as I helped him sip from a cup with a bendy straw. "Am I in trouble for walking home?" The question broke something inside my chest. My brave, sweet boy was worried that he'd done something wrong when he'd been the victim of an adult's cruel decision. I smoothed his hair, still damp from the storm, and kissed his forehead. "No, baby, you're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Aunt Natalie said you'd be mad at me for making her wait." "I'm not mad at you, Dylan. I'm not mad at you at all. But I was mad at someone." I was furious in a way that felt different from ordinary anger. More focused and determined. This wasn't just about family drama or hurt feelings. My sister had put my child's life at risk out of spite, and she seemed to think it was justified. That kind of thinking didn't just happen overnight. It was part of a pattern, a way of seeing the world that made other people's safety secondary to her own convenience and emotions. I spent the rest of that night making lists in my head. Phone calls I needed to make, people I needed to talk to, questions I needed to ask. I thought about other times Dylan had come home from spending time with Natalie, seeming unusually quiet or upset. Incidents I'd attributed to normal family dynamics but now wondered about in a new light. I thought about the casual cruelty in her voice when she'd called him a whiny baby, and the complete lack of concern when I'd told her he was hospitalized. By the time the sun rose over Port Clearwater the next morning, Hurricane Iris had moved on, leaving behind flooded streets, damaged buildings, and a community that would spend weeks cleaning up and rebuilding. The storm was over, but for my family, the real damage was just beginning to be revealed. And unlike the weather, this was something that someone would have to answer for. Dylan was discharged at 10 a.m. with a clean bill of health and strict instructions to take it easy for the next few days. As we drove home through streets littered with debris and fallen trees, he pointed out the damage with the resilient curiosity of childhood, already turning his ordeal into an adventure story he could tell his friends. But I noticed how he flinched when the wind gusted against our car, and how he stayed closer to me than usual as we walked from the garage to the house. The first thing I did when we got home was check the weather data from the previous day. The National Weather Service records showed that at the time Dylan left school, winds in Port Clearwater were sustained at 55 miles per hour, with gusts up to 75. The temperature was 42 degrees, and rain was falling at a rate of over an inch per hour. These weren't conditions for a casual walk. These were conditions that prompted emergency warnings and shelter-in-place orders. The second thing I did was call Anchor Bay Elementary and speak with Principal Martinez about their dismissal procedures during weather emergencies. What I learned made my stomach turn. Natalie had arrived at the school at 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes after the early dismissal, and had signed Dylan out without any problems. But instead of taking him to her car in the parking lot, she'd walked him to the edge of the school property and pointed toward our house, 8 blocks away. Mrs. Rodriguez, the school secretary, had watched from the office window and assumed Natalie's car must be parked on the street due to the crowded lot. It wasn't until Principal Martinez reviewed the security footage the next day that they realized what had actually happened. The cameras clearly showed Natalie walking back to her car alone, while Dylan started the long walk home into the teeth of a hurricane. "Admiral Hayes," Principal Martinez said, his voice carefully professional, "I want you to know that we'll be reviewing our policies about student release during weather emergencies. What happened yesterday should never have been allowed to occur." I appreciated his concern, but policy changes wouldn't undo what Dylan had experienced, and they wouldn't address the bigger problem. My sister had deliberately put my son in danger and felt justified in doing so. This wasn't about school procedures or weather protocols. This was about someone who was supposed to love and protect my child choosing to harm him instead. That afternoon, while Dylan napped on the couch under his favorite blanket, I opened my laptop and began typing. As a Coast Guard officer, I was trained to document incidents thoroughly and accurately. I recorded the timeline of events, the weather conditions, Dylan's medical treatment, and every conversation I'd had with Natalie, Mrs. Kozlov, the school, and the medical staff. I included photographs of Dylan's wet clothes, screenshots of the weather alerts, and copies of the hospital records. I told myself I was just being thorough, just making sure I had all the facts straight in case there were questions later. But deep down, I knew I was building a case, because what Natalie had done wasn't just cruel or irresponsible. In the state of Maine, deliberately exposing a child to conditions that could cause serious bodily harm is a crime. And when that child crosses state lines during the incident, or when the person responsible has a pattern of such behavior, it can become a federal matter. I was a Coast Guard admiral with 22 years of experience in law enforcement and emergency response. I knew how to investigate, how to gather evidence, and how to build a case that would stand up in court. What I didn't know was whether I was ready to use those skills against my own sister. But as I watched my son sleep, still pale from his ordeal, I realized that readiness wasn't the issue. The issue was whether I was willing to let this happen again, to another child, because I'd chosen family loyalty over justice. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was just beginning. And this time, Natalie was going to face consequences that couldn't be dismissed with excuses about dramatic weather or sensitive children. This time, she was going to discover what real accountability looked like. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, with the kind of stillness that follows violent storms. Dylan woke up cheerful and seemingly unaffected by his ordeal, chattering about the adventure of walking through a hurricane while I made his favorite blueberry pancakes. His resilience amazed me, but I noticed how he kept checking the windows, as if expecting the weather to turn dangerous again without warning. Children adapt, but they also remember in ways that don't always show on the surface. I'd requested emergency leave from Lighthouse Point Coast Guard Station, something I'd never done before in my career. Lieutenant Sophia Garrett would handle operations while I focused on what needed to be done at home. When Captain Marcus Rivera called to check on Dylan's condition, I found myself telling him more than I'd intended about Natalie's role in the incident. Rivera had been my commanding officer for 5 years, and he'd developed an instinct for reading between the lines of official reports. "Admiral, I need to ask this directly," Rivera said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when legal matters were involved. "Are you saying your sister deliberately endangered your son during a federal weather emergency?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I was still processing. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Captain." There was a long pause before Rivera spoke again. "You understand that child endangerment during a declared federal emergency falls under different jurisdiction than typical family court matters." I understood more than he realized. The Stafford Act, which governs federal disaster response, includes provisions for prosecuting individuals who willfully endanger others during declared emergencies. Hurricane Iris had triggered federal disaster declarations for 3 counties, including ours. What Natalie had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was potentially a federal crime. After hanging up with Rivera, I drove Dylan to Tommy Chen's house for a playdate. Tommy's mother, Linda Chen, had been our neighbor for 4 years and had watched Dylan grow from a shy kindergartner into the confident 3rd grader he was now. She took one look at Dylan's pale complexion and the dark circles under my eyes and immediately offered to keep him for the entire afternoon. "Take care of whatever you need to take care of," Linda said quietly while the boys disappeared into the backyard to examine storm damage to Tommy's treehouse. "Dylan can stay as long as necessary." I drove back through Port Clearwater's storm-damaged streets, noting the crews working to clear fallen trees and repair power lines. The community was pulling together the way coastal towns always do after disasters. Neighbors helping neighbors, everyone focused on recovery and rebuilding. It made what Natalie had done seem even more incomprehensible. While everyone else was protecting children and keeping families safe, she deliberately put my son at risk. My first stop was the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, where I'd arranged to meet with Detective Ryan Walsh. Walsh specialized in child welfare cases and had a reputation for thorough investigations and successful prosecutions. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from dealing with cases where children's lives hung in the balance. "Admiral Hayes, I've read your initial report, Walsh said as we sat in his office overlooking the courthouse square. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what you're potentially setting in motion. Family cases can get complicated, especially when federal charges are involved. I'd been thinking about nothing else for the past 18 hours. Detective Walsh, if your 8-year-old child had been forced to walk 8 blocks through hurricane-force winds by someone who was supposed to protect him, what would you do? Walsh nodded slowly. I'd want justice, but I'd also want to make sure I had a case that would stick. Tell me about your sister's history with Dylan. Has anything like this happened before? That question opened a door I'd been reluctant to walk through. As I began recounting incidents over the past 3 years, times Dylan had come home upset after spending time with Natalie, occasions when she'd made cruel comments about his sensitivity or my parenting style, moments when her behavior had seemed off but not quite crossing the line into obvious abuse, I realized there was indeed a pattern. There was the time last summer when Natalie had taken Dylan to the beach and left him alone while she went to get ice cream, claiming he needed to learn independence. He'd been 6 years old and couldn't swim well. There was the incident at Christmas when she'd locked him in the basement storage room for 20 minutes as punishment for accidentally breaking an ornament, then told everyone he was being dramatic when he emerged crying. There was the camping trip where she'd made him sleep outside the tent in 40-degree weather because he'd complained about being scared of the dark. Each incident had been explained away at the time. Natalie was teaching him resilience. She was preparing him for the real world. She was correcting the coddling she claimed I was guilty of as a single mother. But as I described them to Detective Walsh, I could see him taking careful notes. And I realized these weren't isolated events. They were a progression. Admiral, what you're describing sounds like a pattern of escalating psychological and physical endangerment, Walsh said when I'd finished. Has anyone else witnessed this behavior? That's when I remembered Mrs. Kozlov's comment about seeing Dylan walking in the storm. If she'd noticed that, what else might she have observed over the years? I thought about Linda Chen's subtle questions about Dylan's bruises after camping trips with Natalie. I remembered Principal Martinez mentioning that Dylan's teacher had expressed concerns about his anxiety levels after family visits. I think there might be several witnesses, I told Walsh. I just never connected the dots before. Walsh leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. Here's what I'd like you to do. Document everything you can remember, with dates and witnesses if possible. Meanwhile, I'll start making some preliminary inquiries. But, Admiral, I need you to understand something important. Once we open this investigation officially, it becomes public record. Your sister will be informed, and if charges are filed, this will go to trial. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny on your family? I thought about Dylan's blue lips, about the 20 minutes that could have made the difference between hospitalization and death, about the casual cruelty in Natalie's voice when she'd called him a whiny baby. Detective Walsh, my son could have died. If that's not worth scrutiny, I don't know what is. From the sheriff's office, I drove to Seaside Medical Center to request copies of Dylan's medical records and to speak with Dr. Vasquez about the incident. She was between patients and agreed to meet with me in her office, a small space decorated with children's drawings and medical certificates. Mrs. Hayes, Dylan's recovery has been excellent, Dr. Vasquez said, pulling up his file on her computer. But I have to say, when I saw his condition yesterday, I was concerned about how he'd been exposed to those elements. 8-year-olds don't typically end up with hypothermia from brief exposure to rain. I explained the circumstances of Dylan's walk home, watching Dr. Vasquez's expression grow increasingly serious as I described the weather conditions and the distance he'd traveled. When I finished, she sat quietly for several moments, then began typing on her keyboard. I'm adding additional notes to Dylan's file, she said. What you've described constitutes child endangerment, in my professional opinion. The combination of wind speed, temperature, precipitation, and duration of exposure created a life-threatening situation for a child of Dylan's age and size. 20 more minutes in those conditions could have resulted in severe hypothermia, cardiac complications, or death. She printed out a copy of Dylan's complete medical record and handed it to me along with a separate document. This is my formal assessment of the incident. If you decide to pursue legal action, this documentation should be helpful. Dr. Vasquez's report was clinical and devastating. She'd calculated the precise risk factors Dylan had faced based on his age, weight, clothing, and the documented weather conditions. The report concluded that exposing a child to those circumstances constituted gross negligence rising to the level of criminal endangerment. My next stop was Anchor Bay Elementary, where Principal Martinez had agreed to meet with me after school hours. The building felt strange and empty without children's voices echoing through the hallways, but Martinez's office was warm and welcoming, filled with student artwork and photographs from school events. Admiral Hayes, I want you to know that we've already begun reviewing our emergency procedures because of what happened to Dylan, Martinez said as we sat across from his desk. But I also want to discuss some other concerns that have come to our attention. He pulled out a folder labeled with Dylan's name and opened it to reveal a collection of incident reports and teacher observations spanning the past 2 years. I'd never seen these documents before, and their contents made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of anger and guilt. Mrs. Patterson, Dylan's second-grade teacher, had noted several instances when Dylan returned from visits with his aunt, seeming withdrawn and anxious. She'd documented unexplained bruises on his arms and legs that Dylan had attributed to, quote, playing too rough with Aunt Natalie. There were reports of Dylan falling asleep in class after weekends spent with Natalie, and observations about his reluctance to discuss family activities. Why wasn't I informed about these concerns? I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. Martinez looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Hayes, your sister was very persuasive when she volunteered to help with school pickup and events. She presented herself as someone who was concerned about Dylan being overprotected. She suggested that you might be too busy with your military responsibilities to notice that Dylan needed more discipline and structure. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Natalie had positioned herself as the concerned family member trying to help an overwhelmed single mother, while simultaneously creating the very problem she claimed to be solving. She'd isolated me from information about my own son while presenting herself as his advocate to school officials. There's something else you should know, Martinez continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Yesterday, after the storm, your sister called the school. She wanted to know if Dylan had arrived safely, and if anyone was asking questions about how he'd gotten home. When I told her that Dylan had been hospitalized, she seemed more concerned about whether we'd reported the incident than about his medical condition. Natalie had been worried about covering her tracks, not about Dylan's welfare. She'd called the school not to check on his safety, but to assess whether she was in trouble. The calculation behind her actions was becoming clearer, and it was far more disturbing than impulsive cruelty. I left the school with copies of all the incident reports and teacher observations, adding them to the growing file of documentation I was building. Each piece of evidence painted the same picture, a pattern of escalating endangerment disguised as tough love, enabled by manipulation and emotional abuse. That evening, after picking up Dylan from Tommy's house and listening to his excited account of their backyard adventures, I sat at my kitchen table with all the documents spread out before me. Medical records, weather reports, school incident reports, witness statements, photographs of Dylan's wet clothes from the storm. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But I also had to confront an uncomfortable truth about my own role in what had happened. I'd seen signs of Natalie's problematic behavior toward Dylan, but I'd explained them away because it was easier than confronting my sister. I'd been grateful for her help with childcare while managing my demanding career, and I'd ignored red flags because acknowledging them would have been inconvenient. The guilt was almost as heavy as the anger, but it also sharpened my resolve. I couldn't undo the times I'd failed to protect Dylan from Natalie's cruelty, but I could make sure it never happened again. And if that meant facing the legal system, public scrutiny, and family destruction, then that's what I would do. I was drafting an email to Detective Walsh with additional information when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Natalie's number, and I debated whether to answer. I needed to hear what she had to say, but I also needed to be careful about how I handled the conversation. If this case went to trial, every interaction with my sister could become evidence. Tori, we need to talk, Natalie said without preamble when I answered. Her voice had a sharp edge I'd learned to recognize as her prelude to attack mode. I've been hearing some very disturbing rumors about you asking questions around town. Questions about me. What kind of questions? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Don't play dumb with me. I know you've been talking to the school, to that detective, probably to half the neighborhood about what happened during the storm. You're trying to make me look like some kind of monster because Dylan got a little wet walking home. A little wet? My son had been hospitalized with hypothermia, and she was still minimizing what had happened. Natalie, Dylan could have died. Oh, please. You're being ridiculous, just like always. Kids are tougher than you think. Maybe if you didn't baby him so much, he wouldn't fall apart every time life gets a little challenging. There it was again. The implication that Dylan's suffering was somehow his fault or mine, that Natalie's actions were justified because we were both too weak to handle real-world consequences. I could hear the psychology behind her words now, the way she positioned herself as the reasonable adult dealing with over-emotional, oversensitive people who couldn't handle truth. I want you to stop this investigation nonsense right now, Natalie continued, her voice rising. You're embarrassing the whole family with this drama. Mom is beside herself with worry about what people will think. Our mother, Grace Morgan, lived in Florida now and had been kept informed about Dylan's hospitalization through carefully edited reports from Natalie. I wondered what version of events she'd been told, and how much of the truth she actually knew. Natalie, I'm not stopping anything. What you did to Dylan was criminal. Criminal? Are you out of your mind? I'm his aunt. I love that boy. Everything I do is for his own good, to make him stronger and more independent. You can't just wrap him in bubble wrap forever, Tori. The world is a tough place. The rationalization was perfect in its circular logic. Dylan needed to be toughened up, therefore anything that caused him suffering was good for him. Therefore Natalie was actually helping him by putting him in danger. It was the kind of reasoning that allowed people to justify terrible actions while maintaining their self-image as caring, responsible adults. Natalie, listen to me very carefully, I said, making sure my voice was calm and clear. You will not be alone with Dylan again. You will not pick him up from school, take him on outings, or babysit him. That's not negotiable. There was a moment of silence, then a sound that might have been laughter but felt more like a growl. You can't keep me away from my own nephew. I have rights too, you know? And maybe it's time someone looked into whether you're really fit to be raising a child on your own. A single mother with a demanding military career, always putting work before family, never around to actually parent her own son. The threat was unmistakable. If I continued pursuing consequences for what she'd done to Dylan, she would try to have him taken away from me. She would use my career, my dedication to serving my country, as evidence that I was an unfit mother. The audacity was staggering, but it was also revealing. This was how Natalie's mind worked. When confronted with accountability, she escalated and attacked. You do what you think you need to do, Natalie, I said quietly. But you're not getting near my son again. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me sitting in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of her crimes, listening to the sound of Dylan's laughter drifting down from his bedroom where he was playing with his action figures. The contrast between her threats and his innocence crystallized everything I needed to understand about this situation. The next morning, I called Detective Walsh and reported the conversation with Natalie, including her threats about challenging my custody of Dylan. Walsh took careful notes and asked me to document any future attempts at contact from my sister. Admiral, your sister's response to this investigation is actually helpful to our case, Walsh said. Instead of showing remorse or concern for Dylan's welfare, she's escalating her attacks on you and continuing to minimize the severity of what happened. That's going to play poorly with the jury if this goes to trial. Walsh had been busy during the 24 hours since our initial meeting. He'd interviewed Mrs. Kozlov, who'd provided a detailed statement about seeing Dylan struggling through the storm. He'd spoken with Linda Chen, who'd confirmed her observations about Dylan's anxiety after visits with Natalie. He'd contacted the National Weather Service to obtain official documentation of the hurricane conditions at the time of the incident. Admiral, based on the evidence you've provided and the interviews I've conducted, "I believe we have grounds for filing charges," Walsh said. "But there's something else you should know. I've been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office about this case. The federal angle was something I'd expected, but hadn't fully processed until that moment. Hurricane Iris had been a declared federal disaster, which meant federal resources had been deployed for rescue and recovery operations. Deliberately endangering a child during a federal emergency wasn't just a state crime. It was a federal offense that carried much more serious penalties." "What does that mean for the case?" I asked. "It means your sister could be looking at federal charges in addition to state charges. Child endangerment during a declared disaster is a felony that carries up to 10 years in federal prison. If the federal prosecutor decides to take the case, it gets handled by a completely different system with much more serious consequences. 10 years in federal prison." I thought about Natalie's casual dismissal of Dylan's suffering, her threats to challenge my custody, her complete inability to accept responsibility for what she'd done. Maybe serious consequences were exactly what she needed to understand the gravity of her actions. Over the next week, I watched my son return to his normal routine while I navigated the complex process of building a criminal case against my sister. Dylan went back to school, played with his friends, and seemed to recover completely from his physical ordeal. But I noticed subtle changes in his behavior that suggested the emotional impact was still working its way through his system. He asked more questions about the weather forecast each morning. He wanted to know exactly when I would pick him up from school and became anxious if I was even a few minutes late. He started having nightmares about being lost in storms, waking up confused and scared in the middle of the night. Dr. Vasquez had warned me that psychological trauma from the incident might take longer to heal than the physical effects. Meanwhile, the investigation was expanding in ways I hadn't anticipated. Detective Walsh had discovered that this wasn't Natalie's first encounter with child welfare authorities. 3 years earlier, when she'd lived in Vermont, she'd been investigated for leaving her neighbor's children unsupervised at a public pool while she went shopping. The case had been closed without charges, but the pattern of poor judgment and child endangerment was documented. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Webb, agreed to meet with me to discuss the potential federal case. Webb was in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of controlled intensity that comes from years of prosecuting serious crimes. Her office in the federal courthouse was decorated with commendations and photographs from high-profile cases. "Admiral Hayes, I've reviewed the evidence Detective Walsh has compiled, and I believe we have a strong case for federal prosecution," Webb said as we sat across from her imposing mahogany desk. "What your sister did wasn't just child endangerment. It was willful disregard for human life during a federal emergency. That's a crime we take very seriously." Webb explained that the federal case would focus on Natalie's deliberate decision to expose Dylan to life-threatening conditions during Hurricane Iris, when federal disaster declarations were in effect and emergency responders were risking their lives to keep people safe. The symbolism was powerful. While Coast Guard personnel like me were working to protect the community, my own sister was deliberately putting a child in danger. "There's another aspect to this case that strengthens our position," Webb continued. "Your sister's pattern of manipulation and her attempts to interfere with the investigation show consciousness of guilt. Her phone call to the school after the incident, her threats against you, her complete lack of remorse, all of that demonstrates that she knew her actions were wrong and was trying to cover them up." The federal grand jury would convene in 3 weeks to consider the charges. If they voted to indict, Natalie would be arrested and formally charged with child endangerment during a federal disaster, a felony that carried substantial prison time. The case would then proceed to trial unless she accepted a plea agreement. As I left the federal courthouse that afternoon, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. Justice was moving forward, but it was also tearing apart what remained of my family. My mother had been calling daily, begging me to drop the charges and work things out privately. Other relatives were choosing sides, some supporting my decision to protect Dylan, others convinced that I was overreacting and destroying family relationships over a misunderstanding. But every time I wavered, I thought about Dylan's blue lips and the medical report stating that 20 more minutes could have killed him. I thought about the pattern of escalating abuse documented in school reports and witness statements. I thought about Natalie's threats and her complete inability to acknowledge wrongdoing. Most importantly, I thought about other children who might be in Natalie's care in the future. If I didn't pursue consequences now, if I let her behavior slide because she was family, what would prevent her from endangering another child the next time she felt angry or inconvenienced? The grand jury met on a rainy Thursday morning 3 weeks later. I wasn't required to testify. Detective Walsh and the documentary evidence were sufficient for the indictment, but I waited in the courthouse hallway while 23 citizens reviewed the case against my sister. The proceeding took less than 2 hours, and when the foreman emerged to deliver the verdict, I knew from his expression what it would be. True bill. Natalie Morgan Hayes was formally indicted on federal charges of child endangerment during a declared disaster, interference with emergency operations, and making false statements to federal investigators. An arrest warrant was issued immediately. Detective Walsh found me in the courthouse lobby after the grand jury dispersed. "Admiral, your sister will be arrested this afternoon. Given the federal charges, she won't be eligible for bail initially. The arraignment is scheduled for Monday morning." I drove home through the rain, thinking about how much had changed since Hurricane Iris had torn through our community 6 weeks earlier. The storm damage had been repaired, life had returned to normal, and most people had moved on from that frightening day. But for my family, the real storm was just beginning. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jarring me awake from the first peaceful sleep I'd managed in weeks. The voice on the other end belonged to someone I'd never heard before, but her words made my blood run cold in ways that had nothing to do with the October chill seeping through my bedroom windows. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Amanda Thornton from Child Protective Services in Bangor. I'm calling because we've received a complaint about your son Dylan's living situation. We need to schedule a home visit within the next 48 hours. I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. "A complaint? What kind of complaint?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling in the background. "The report alleges that you've been subjecting your child to dangerous situations, specifically forcing him to walk through severe weather conditions. There are also concerns about your ability to provide adequate supervision due to your military obligations." Natalie had made good on her threat. While sitting in federal custody awaiting trial for endangering Dylan, she'd somehow managed to file a complaint with Child Protective Services, claiming that I was the one putting him at risk. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also strategically brilliant in its manipulation of the system designed to protect children. "Miss Thornton, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "I'm the one who filed charges against my sister for child endangerment. She's currently facing federal prosecution for forcing my son to walk home during Hurricane Iris." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand this is a complicated family situation. That's exactly why we need to conduct a thorough investigation. Can you be available Thursday morning at 10? After hanging up, I sat in the growing dawn light of my bedroom, processing what had just happened. Natalie was fighting back from federal custody, using the very system that should have been protecting Dylan to attack me instead. She understood that even unfounded accusations would create chaos in our lives, force me to defend myself instead of focusing on her prosecution, and potentially give her leverage in plea negotiations. I made coffee with shaking hands and called Captain Rivera before 7 a.m. He answered on the second ring, alert and professional despite the early hour. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and reassuring. "Admiral, you have the full support of this command. I'll have our legal affairs officer contact you within the hour, and we'll prepare whatever documentation you need about your service record and fitness for duty. This is clearly a retaliatory action by someone facing serious federal charges." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, the Coast Guard's legal affairs officer for our district, called me at 7:32 a.m. with a tone that was both sympathetic and strategically focused. She'd already reviewed my personnel file and spoken with Captain Rivera about the situation. "Admiral Hayes, what your sister is attempting is unfortunately common in child custody disputes," Walsh explained. "When people face serious criminal charges involving children, they often try to shift blame by attacking the victim's family. We're going to make sure Child Protective Services has a complete picture of your exemplary service record and your dedication to your son's welfare. Walsh arranged for me to meet with the base's Family Services Coordinator, who would conduct her own assessment of Dylan's well-being and my parenting capabilities. She also prepared a comprehensive report documenting my military service, including commendations for leadership, community service, and emergency response during natural disasters. The irony was perfect. While Natalie was in federal custody for endangering a child during a hurricane, I was being praised for helping save lives during the same storm. Dylan was eating cereal at the kitchen table when I ended the call with Lieutenant Commander Walsh. He looked up at me with the kind of perceptive awareness that children develop when they sense adult stress, even when they don't understand its source. "Mom, are you okay? You seem worried about something." I sat down across from him, watching him methodically eat his breakfast, with the focused concentration of an 8-year-old who'd learned to find comfort in routine. "Dylan, some people are going to come visit our house on Thursday to make sure you're safe and happy. They might ask you some questions about our family." His spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Are they going to ask about Aunt Natalie and the storm?" The fact that he immediately connected this visit to that incident told me he understood more about the ongoing situation than I'd realized. Children are remarkably good at picking up adult conversations and piecing together information, even when we think we're protecting them from complicated realities. They might ask about that, yes. But Dylan, I want you to know that you should always tell the truth about what happened. You're not in trouble, and nothing you say will get you in trouble. These people just want to make sure you're safe. He nodded solemnly, then surprised me by reaching across the table to pat my hand with sticky fingers. "Mom, I feel safe with you. I always feel safe with you." The simple declaration nearly broke my heart. This brave, resilient boy had survived hypothermia, witnessed family destruction, and was now facing investigation by strangers, but he was trying to comfort me. I squeezed his hand gently and promised myself that I would fight whatever battles were necessary to protect his sense of security. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and documentation. I gathered Dylan's medical records, school reports, photographs of our home and family activities, and character references from neighbors, teachers, and fellow service members. Linda Chen wrote a beautiful letter describing her observations of my relationship with Dylan and his obvious happiness and well-being. Mrs. Kozlov provided a statement about my dedication as a single mother and my involvement in community activities. Principal Martinez compiled a folder of positive reports from Dylan's teachers, along with documentation of his academic progress and social development. The contrast with the incident reports about his anxiety after visits with Natalie was stark and powerful. Dr. Vasquez provided a letter confirming Dylan's excellent health and the appropriateness of his medical care. Most importantly, I prepared Dylan for the visit without coaching him on what to say. I explained that the social workers would want to see his bedroom, ask about his daily routine, and understand how he felt about living with me. I assured him that honesty was always the right choice, and that he should never worry about protecting adult feelings with his answers. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my emotional state as I waited for Amanda Thornton and her colleague to arrive. Dylan had gone to school as usual, which meant the initial inspection would focus on our home environment and my responses to their questions. The actual interview with Dylan would happen later, after school, in our familiar living room rather than in an intimidating office setting. Amanda Thornton was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that come from seeing too many families in crisis. Her partner, Mark Rodriguez, was older and quieter, taking careful notes while Thornton asked questions and examined our home. They were thorough but not intrusive, professional but not cold, and I found myself cautiously optimistic about their assessment. They photographed Dylan's bedroom, noting the age-appropriate toys, books, and decorations that reflected his interests in marine biology and space exploration. They examined our kitchen, checking for adequate food supplies, and noting the family photos covering the refrigerator. They reviewed Dylan's medical records, school reports, and the character references I'd compiled. "Mrs. Hayes, I have to ask directly about the allegations in the complaint we received," Thornton said as we sat in my living room reviewing documents. Your sister claims that you regularly expose Dylan to dangerous weather conditions and that your military duties prevent you from providing adequate supervision. I took a deep breath and provided a complete account of Hurricane Iris, Natalie's actions, and the ongoing federal prosecution. I showed them Dr. Vasquez's medical assessment, the Weather Service reports, and Detective Walsh's investigation files. I explained the timeline of events and provided documentation of Natalie's pattern of endangering Dylan over several years. Rodriguez looked up from his notepad, his expression thoughtful. So the person who filed this complaint is currently in federal custody for child endangerment? That's correct. She's facing up to 10 years in federal prison for forcing Dylan to walk home during a declared hurricane emergency. Thornton and Rodriguez exchanged glances, the kind of professional communication that happens between experienced investigators when a case suddenly becomes clear. Mrs. Hayes, we're going to complete our investigation according to protocol, but I want you to know that retaliatory complaints are unfortunately common in criminal cases involving children. When Dylan came home from school that afternoon, he handled the interview with remarkable composure. He showed the social workers his room, explained his daily routine, and answered their questions with the straightforward honesty of a child who has nothing to hide. When they asked about the storm incident, he recounted the events without drama or embellishment, simply stating facts about what had happened and how it had made him feel. Dylan, do you feel safe living with your mom? Thornton asked gently. Yes, I always feel safe with her. She takes care of me when I'm sick, helps me with homework, and makes sure I have everything I need. She works hard, but she always has time for me. What about when you spend time with other family members? Dylan's expression grew more serious. Aunt Natalie sometimes gets mad and makes me do things that scare me. But Mom doesn't let me stay with her anymore because of what happened in the storm. I'm glad because I didn't like being scared all the time. The interview concluded with Thornton explaining that they would complete their report within 2 weeks, and that preliminary findings suggested no concerns about Dylan's safety or well-being in my care. They would recommend that the complaint be closed without further action, though the formal process would take several more days to complete. After the social workers left, Dylan and I made hot chocolate and sat on the couch talking about the day. He seemed relieved that the interview was over and proud that he'd been able to answer all their questions. I was struck by his resilience and maturity, qualities that had been tested repeatedly over the past 2 months but never broken. That evening, I received a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Webb with an update on Natalie's case. The federal prosecutor had reviewed the Child Protective Services complaint and viewed it as additional evidence of Natalie's manipulative behavior and refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. Admiral Hayes, your sister's attempt to deflect blame onto you actually strengthens our case, Webb explained. Instead of showing remorse for endangering Dylan, she's doubling down and trying to paint herself as the victim. That kind of behavior doesn't play well with juries, and it's making her attorney's job much more difficult. Webb also informed me that Natalie's defense team had approached the prosecution about a possible plea agreement. They were hoping to avoid trial by accepting responsibility for a reduced charge, but Webb was not inclined to be generous. Given Natalie's continued attacks on me and her refusal to acknowledge the severity of what she'd done to Dylan, what kind of sentence would she face if convicted at trial? I asked. Given the federal charges and her pattern of behavior, she's looking at between 5 and 10 years in federal prison. A plea agreement might reduce that to 3 to 5 years, but only if she accepts full responsibility and agrees to have no contact with you or Dylan. The prospect of Natalie spending years in federal prison was sobering, but I couldn't summon much sympathy for someone who is continuing to traumatize my son even from custody. Her decision to file false charges against me showed that she viewed Dylan's welfare as secondary to her own legal troubles, and that made me more determined than ever to see this case through to its conclusion. 2 weeks later, Amanda Thornton called to inform me that Child Protective Services was officially closing their investigation, with no findings of abuse or neglect. Their report praised my parenting skills, noted Dylan's obvious happiness and security, and recommended that no further action be taken. The complaint was classified as unfounded and retaliatory, which would become part of the record if Natalie ever attempted similar accusations in the future. The relief was enormous, but it was tempered by the realization that this was likely just the first of several attacks Natalie would launch as her trial date approached. Desperate people in legal trouble often become increasingly erratic and vindictive, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. What came next was a call from my mother, Grace Morgan, who had flown up from Florida to visit Natalie in federal custody. Mom's voice was strained and emotional, heavy with the kind of family loyalty that prioritizes peace over justice. "Victoria, I've talked to Natalie extensively about what happened, and I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding," Mom said, launching into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "She loves Dylan dearly and would never intentionally hurt him. Yes, she made an error in judgment about the weather, but this whole federal prosecution is completely out of proportion to what actually occurred." I listened patiently while Mom recounted Natalie's version of events, which bore little resemblance to reality. In Natalie's telling, she'd simply miscalculated the severity of the storm and had allowed Dylan to walk a short distance in what she thought was light rain. She'd been trying to teach him independence and self-reliance, skills she felt I was failing to provide. The hypothermia was an unfortunate accident, not the predictable result of criminal negligence. "Mom, Dylan could have died," I said when she finished her speech. Dr. Vasquez confirmed that 20 more minutes in those conditions could have been fatal. "Doctors always exaggerate to protect themselves from lawsuits," Mom replied dismissively. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for. When you and Natalie were little, you walked to school in all kinds of weather and nobody made a federal case out of it." The generational dismissal of legitimate safety concerns was frustrating but not surprising. Mom came from an era when childhood dangers were minimized, and parental accountability was less clearly defined. But her willingness to excuse Natalie's behavior while criticizing my decision to protect Dylan revealed where her loyalties lay. "Victoria, I'm asking you as your mother to drop these charges and let our family heal," Mom continued. "Natalie is willing to apologize and promise it won't happen again. Surely that's enough to resolve this situation without destroying her entire future." "What about Dylan's future?" I asked. "What about the trauma he's experienced and the pattern of abuse that's been documented over several years? Why is Natalie's comfort more important than my son's safety?" Mom was quiet for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "You always were the stubborn one, Victoria, just like your father. Always had to make everything into a bigger issue than it needed to be." The conversation ended without resolution, but it clarified something important for me. My extended family was not going to support my decision to hold Natalie accountable, which meant Dylan and I were essentially on our own in this fight. That realization was both lonely and liberating. I no longer had to worry about family approval or maintaining relationships with people who prioritized Natalie's convenience over Dylan's welfare. 3 days later, Natalie made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. She called me collect from federal custody, and I accepted the charges because I wanted to hear what she had to say. Her voice was different than I remembered, smaller and more uncertain, but the underlying entitlement was still there. "Tori, I've been doing a lot of thinking while I've been in here," she began, adopting the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation carefully. "I realized that I made some mistakes with Dylan, and I want to make things right between us." "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, genuinely curious to see if she would actually acknowledge what she'd done. I should have been more careful about the weather that day. I should have waited for the storm to pass before letting Dylan walk home. I can see now that it was more dangerous than I realized at the time. It was a carefully worded non-apology that admitted error without accepting responsibility. She'd let Dylan walk home, as if it had been his choice. The weather had been more dangerous than she'd realized, as if the hurricane warnings and emergency alerts had been unclear. She was still positioning herself as someone who'd made an innocent mistake, rather than someone who deliberately endangered a child. "Natalie, you didn't let Dylan walk home. You forced him to walk home in hurricane conditions because you were angry at me. There's a difference." "That's not how it happened, Tori. You're remembering it wrong because you're upset. I was trying to teach Dylan to be more independent, and yes, I misjudged the weather, but I never intended for him to get hurt." The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. I was remembering wrong. I was upset, and therefore unreliable. Her intentions had been good, even if her judgment was poor. She was using classic manipulation techniques to rewrite history and position herself as a misunderstood victim, rather than a perpetrator. Natalie, I'm not dropping the charges. What you did to Dylan was criminal, and you're going to face the consequences. There was a long pause, then her voice changed again, becoming harder and more threatening. You know, Tori, prison gives you a lot of time to think about things. About family loyalty and who really has your back when things get difficult. About how some people will throw their own blood under the bus to make themselves look good. Are you threatening me? I'm just saying that families who stick together survive better than families who tear each other apart. And Dylan's gonna grow up knowing that his aunt went to prison because his mother chose revenge over forgiveness. The call ended there, but the threat lingered. Natalie was promising to continue her psychological warfare against Dylan and me, even from prison. She would spend years poisoning family relationships and trying to convince Dylan that I was the villain in this story. It was a sobering reminder that legal victory wouldn't necessarily mean the end of her efforts to harm us. That night, I sat at my kitchen table drafting a letter to Assistant U.S. Attorney Webb, documenting Natalie's phone call and her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. I included transcripts of my conversations with my mother and details about the Child Protective Services complaint. I wanted the prosecution to have a complete picture of Natalie's ongoing manipulation and retaliation. As I wrote, I thought about the choice that lay ahead of me. I could still drop the charges, accept Natalie's non-apology, and try to restore family peace. It would be easier in many ways, and it would certainly make my mother happy. But it would also send Dylan the message that adults who harm children can escape consequences through manipulation and family pressure. I looked at the refrigerator, covered with Dylan's artwork and school photos, and made my decision. My son deserved to grow up in a world where adults were held accountable for their actions, where children's safety mattered more than family harmony, and where speaking truth was more important than keeping peace. If that meant standing alone against my entire extended family, then that's what I would do. The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and I was ready to testify about what Natalie had done to my son. I was ready to face whatever retaliation she planned from prison, and I was ready to show Dylan that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let dangerous behavior continue, even when it tears your family apart. Justice was coming, and this time, no amount of manipulation would change the outcome. The federal courthouse in Portland, Maine, stood like a granite monument to justice, its imposing columns and American flag creating the kind of backdrop that made legal proceedings feel weighty and permanent. I'd walked past this building hundreds of times during my years stationed at Lighthouse Point, but I'd never imagined I'd be entering it as a witness in a criminal case against my own sister. The morning of jury selection arrived cold and clear, with the kind of November light that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. I sat in the witness waiting room with Detective Ryan Walsh, reviewing my testimony one final time, while Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Webb prepared for what she'd described as the most straightforward child endangerment case she'd prosecuted in years. Admiral Hayes, the defense is going to try to paint this as a family dispute that got out of hand, Webb had explained during our preparation meeting. They'll argue that your sister made a poor judgment call but didn't intend to harm Dylan. Our job is to show the jury that intent doesn't matter when you deliberately expose a child to life-threatening conditions during a federal emergency. Through the waiting room's small window, I could see protesters gathering on the courthouse steps. Most carried signs supporting child safety and accountability, but a few held messages about government overreach and family privacy. The case had attracted regional media attention, partly because of the federal charges and partly because it involved a Coast Guard officer prosecuting her own sister. The symbolism was unavoidable. A woman sworn to protect and serve was fighting to hold her own family accountable for endangering a child. Dylan was not required to testify, something Webb and I had agreed was in his best interest. His medical records, the school reports, and the testimony of adult witnesses would tell his story without subjecting him to cross-examination or courtroom drama. But he knew the trial was happening, and he'd asked thoughtful questions about justice and family loyalty that revealed his 8-year-old mind was wrestling with concepts most adults struggled to understand. Judge Patricia Brennan called the court to order at 9 a.m. sharp, her authoritative voice filling the courtroom with the kind of gravity that made everyone sit straighter in their seats. She was known for running efficient proceedings and having little patience for legal theatrics, qualities that Webb had suggested would work in our favor. Natalie entered the courtroom in handcuffs and a federal detention uniform, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I remembered. 4 months in custody had changed her appearance. Her hair was shorter and grayer, her face thinner, her posture less confident. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the protective instinct that had connected us as children. But then I remembered Dylan's blue lips and the sound of his frightened breathing as he'd fought hypothermia on our front porch. Her defense attorney, Marcus Thompson, was a seasoned federal defender with a reputation for creative arguments and sympathetic presentations of difficult clients. During opening statements, he painted Natalie as a loving aunt who'd made a terrible mistake in judgment, a woman whose dedication to her nephew had led her to push him toward independence in ways that inadvertently created danger. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Thompson said, his voice warm and conversational, "this case is about a tragic misunderstanding between family members that escalated into a federal prosecution. Natalie Hayes loved her nephew Dylan deeply and was trying to teach him resilience and self-reliance. She misjudged the severity of the weather conditions that day, yes, but her actions were motivated by care, not malice." Webb's opening statement was clinical and devastating. She laid out the timeline of Hurricane Iris, the federal emergency declarations, the specific weather conditions Dylan had faced, and the medical consequences of his exposure. She presented Natalie's actions not as a mistake, but as a deliberate choice to prioritize her own anger over a child's safety. "The defendant didn't misjudge the weather," Webb told the jury. "She received the same emergency alerts as everyone else in the community. She saw the same hurricane warnings, the same shelter-in-place orders, the same life-threatening conditions that prompted the declaration of a federal disaster. But when an 8-year-old child asked to wait for his mother's protection, she chose to send him out into that storm alone, because she was angry and wanted to prove a point." The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 3 days. Dr. Elena Vasquez testified about Dylan's condition when he'd arrived at the hospital, explaining in precise medical terms how close he'd come to serious injury or death. The National Weather Service meteorologist who'd tracked Hurricane Iris walked the jury through the specific conditions at the time Dylan had been forced to walk home, using charts and graphs that made the danger undeniable. Mrs. Helen Kozloff, our elderly neighbor, testified about seeing Dylan struggling through the storm, her voice breaking as she described his small figure being buffeted by hurricane-force winds. Principal Martinez presented the school's security footage, showing Natalie walking Dylan to the edge of school property and pointing toward home before returning alone to her car. Detective Walsh methodically presented the evidence of Natalie's pattern of endangering Dylan over several years, painting a picture of escalating psychological and physical abuse disguised as character building. The jury listened intently as he described the camping incident where she'd made Dylan sleep outside in freezing temperatures, the beach episode where she'd left him alone near dangerous surf, and the Christmas punishment where she'd locked him in a basement storage room. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand with the same controlled composure I used during Coast Guard operations. Webb guided me through my account of that day, from the emergency response at the station to finding Dylan collapsed on our porch. I kept my voice steady and factual, focusing on the timeline of events and the medical consequences rather than the emotional impact. "Admiral Hayes, in your professional opinion as a Coast Guard officer, with 22 years of emergency response experience, were the conditions that day suitable for an 8-year-old child to walk 8 blocks alone?" Webb asked. "Absolutely not. Hurricane Iris had triggered federal disaster declarations and shelter-in-place orders. We were conducting water rescues and evacuating families from flooded homes. No child should have been outside in those conditions, period." Thompson's cross-examination was aggressive but respectful, focusing on my military training and whether it might have made me overly cautious about weather conditions that civilians might view differently. He suggested that my career in emergency response had made me hypersensitive to risks that ordinary families managed routinely. "Admiral Hayes, Isn't it true that your military background might cause you to overreact to situations that civilian families handle with less drama? Thompson asked. Mr. Thompson, my military background taught me to assess risks accurately and respond appropriately. A child with hypothermia isn't drama, it's a medical emergency. The fact that Dylan survived doesn't make what happened to him acceptable. Thompson also tried to explore my relationship with Natalie, suggesting that family tensions and jealousy about her close relationship with Dylan had motivated my decision to pursue federal charges. He painted me as a career-focused single mother who resented my sister's involvement in Dylan's life and had used the storm incident as an excuse to eliminate her from our family. Isn't it true, Admiral, that you were looking for reasons to exclude your sister from Dylan's life because you felt threatened by their bond? Thompson asked. The question was designed to make me appear petty and vindictive, but it also gave me an opportunity to address the real issue at the heart of the case. Mr. Thompson, I wasn't threatened by their bond. I was terrified by her pattern of putting him in danger. A loving relationship doesn't involve locking children in dark spaces, exposing them to hypothermia, or abandoning them in unsafe situations. What my sister called bonding, I call abuse. The defense's case relied heavily on character witnesses who testified about Natalie's love for Dylan and her positive qualities as an aunt and community member. Her former coworkers described her as caring and responsible. Her neighbors spoke about her helpfulness during community events, and her friends emphasized her devotion to her nephew. But Thompson's most powerful witness was our mother, Grace Morgan, who had flown up from Florida to testify on Natalie's behalf. Mom took the stand wearing her best dress and the kind of determined expression that had gotten our family through various crises over the years. Mrs. Morgan, can you tell the jury about your daughter Natalie's relationship with her nephew Dylan? Thompson asked. Natalie adored that boy from the moment he was born, Mom said, her voice strong and clear. She was always taking him on adventures, teaching him to be brave and independent. Victoria was so busy with her career that Natalie stepped in to provide the kind of guidance and attention Dylan needed. Mom's testimony was designed to reinforce the defense's theme that Natalie was a loving aunt whose judgment had been questioned by an overly protective mother. She described incidents where Natalie had encouraged Dylan to try new things and push past his comfort zones, framing these as positive influences rather than dangerous exposures. Mrs. Morgan, in your opinion, did Natalie intend to harm Dylan on the day of the storm? Thompson asked. Absolutely not. Natalie would never deliberately hurt Dylan. She loves him too much. This whole situation has been blown completely out of proportion by Victoria's overprotective instincts and her need to blame someone else for what was simply an accident. Webb's cross-examination of our mother was gentle but pointed. She didn't attack Mom's credibility or motivations, but she did establish that Mom lived in Florida and relied on Natalie's reports about her interactions with Dylan. She also drew attention to the pattern of dangerous incidents that Mom had dismissed or minimized over the years. Mrs. Morgan, were you aware that Dylan had been hospitalized for hypothermia after the incident your daughter describes as an accident? Webb asked. Yes, but children bounce back quickly from these things. He was fine the next day. Were you aware that medical experts testified that Dylan came within 20 minutes of potentially fatal complications from his exposure? Mom hesitated, then said, Doctors always say things like that to protect themselves from lawsuits. Dylan was never in real danger. Webb's final questions established that Mom had not been present during any of the incidents where Dylan had been endangered, had not reviewed the medical evidence, and had not spoken directly with any of the witnesses or investigators. Her testimony was based entirely on Natalie's version of events and her own desire to believe the best about her daughter. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Natalie herself took the stand in her own defense. Thompson had clearly coached her extensively, and she presented herself as a remorseful aunt who'd made a terrible error in judgment but had learned from her mistake. Ms. Hayes, can you tell the jury what happened on the day Dylan walked home from school? Thompson asked. Natalie's voice was soft and shaky as she recounted her version of events. She claimed she'd genuinely believed the storm was less severe than it actually was, that she'd thought Dylan would benefit from a short walk in what she perceived as light rain and wind. She acknowledged that she'd been frustrated with me for being overprotective, but insisted that her decision to let Dylan walk had been motivated by a desire to help him become more independent. "I would never ever do anything to hurt Dylan," Natalie said, tears streaming down her face. "He's the most precious thing in the world to me. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it came from love, not malice." Webb's cross-examination was methodical and relentless. She walked Natalie through the timeline of that day, highlighting the numerous emergency alerts and warnings she'd received. She presented phone records showing that Natalie had checked weather updates multiple times before deciding to make Dylan walk home, proving that she'd been fully aware of the dangerous conditions. "Ms. Hayes, you testified that you thought the storm was less severe than it actually was, but phone records show you accessed the National Weather Service website 6 times between 2 and 3 p.m. that day. What were you looking for?" Natalie struggled to answer, finally admitting that she'd been monitoring the storm's progress and timing. Webb then presented evidence that Natalie had called 3 friends to warn them not to drive in the dangerous conditions, conversations that had occurred just minutes before she'd sent Dylan out into the same weather. "So you knew the conditions were too dangerous for your adult friends to drive in, but you believed they were safe for an 8-year-old child to walk in?" Webb asked. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I was upset and angry, and I made a poor decision." Webb's final line of questioning focused on Natalie's behavior after the incident, her lack of remorse, her threats against me, and her attempts to blame Dylan for his own suffering. She presented recordings of Natalie's phone calls from custody, including the one where she'd described Dylan as a whiny baby who needed to toughen up. "Ms. Hayes, even after learning that Dylan had been hospitalized with hypothermia, you continued to blame him for being too sensitive. Is that correct?" "I was scared and defensive. I said things I didn't mean. But you filed a false complaint with Child Protective Services claiming that Admiral Hayes was endangering Dylan. That happened months after the incident, when you'd had plenty of time to reflect. Was that also something you didn't mean?" Natalie's composure cracked completely at that point. She became defensive and angry, revealing glimpses of the entitled, manipulative personality that had led to Dylan's endangerment in the first place. Her testimony had begun as an opportunity for redemption, but ended as confirmation of everything the prosecution had alleged about her character. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon in late November, with winter light fading outside the courthouse windows. Thompson made one final appeal for mercy, asking the jury to consider Natalie's remorse and her genuine love for Dylan. He argued that federal prison was too harsh a punishment for what was essentially a family tragedy, caused by poor judgment rather than criminal intent. Webb's closing argument was both passionate and precise, reminding the jury of their responsibility to protect children from adults who prioritize their own emotions over safety. She walked them through the evidence one final time, emphasizing that Dylan's survival didn't excuse the deliberate endangerment he'd suffered. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant wants you to believe that love justifies what she did to Dylan Hayes. But love doesn't expose children to life-threatening conditions during federal emergencies. Love doesn't ignore hurricane warnings and emergency alerts. Love doesn't force a scared 8-year-old boy to walk alone through conditions that prompted water rescues and evacuations." The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days, emerging from their discussions with the kind of solemn determination that suggested they'd taken their responsibility seriously. Judge Brennan called the court to order, and the foreman stood to deliver their verdict. "On the charge of child endangerment during a federal disaster, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of interference with emergency operations, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of making false statements to federal investigators, we find the defendant guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom with finality. Natalie slumped in her chair, her face pale with shock and disbelief. Our mother began crying softly in the gallery, and I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was difficult to process. Judge Brennan scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, giving the probation office time to prepare a comprehensive report on Natalie's background and the impact of her crimes. Webb had warned me that federal sentencing guidelines were complex, but given the nature of the charges and Natalie's lack of genuine remorse, she expected a sentence in the range of 4 to 7 years. As I left the courthouse that afternoon, I was approached by several reporters asking for comments about the verdict. I kept my statement brief and focused on the broader implications of the case. This trial was never about family drama or personal disputes, I told them. It was about holding adults accountable when they deliberately endanger children. The jury's verdict sends a clear message that children's safety is more important than adult convenience or emotions. That evening, I sat with Dylan in our living room, trying to explain what the verdict meant in terms he could understand. He listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about justice and consequences, and whether Natalie would ever be allowed to visit us again. "Mom, is Aunt Natalie going to jail because of me?" he asked, his voice small and worried. "No, Dylan. Aunt Natalie is going to jail because of choices she made. You didn't do anything wrong, and you're not responsible for the consequences of her actions." He nodded solemnly, then surprised me by saying, "I'm glad she can't make other kids walk in storms now." The wisdom and empathy in that statement reminded me why this fight had been worth every difficult moment. Dylan understood that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about protection. By holding Natalie accountable, we were potentially preventing other children from suffering the same endangerment he'd experienced. 3 weeks later, we returned to the courthouse for sentencing. Judge Brennan had reviewed the probation report, victim impact statements, and character references from both sides. Her decision was swift and decisive. "Ms. Hayes, you have been convicted of serious federal crimes involving the deliberate endangerment of a child during a declared emergency. Your actions were not the result of poor judgment or momentary confusion. They were the culmination of a pattern of abusive behavior toward your nephew, behavior that escalated to life-threatening proportions." Natalie stood as the judge continued, her face expressionless as she listened to her fate being decided. "The court sentences you to 63 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are prohibited from having any contact with the victim or his mother during your incarceration and probation. You will also be required to complete parenting classes and anger management counseling as conditions of your release." 63 months. Just over 5 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release with strict conditions. It was a substantial sentence that reflected the seriousness of what Natalie had done, and the court's recognition that children deserve protection from adults who claim to love them while putting them in danger. As Natalie was led away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one final time. There was no remorse in her expression, no acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused Dylan. There was only anger and resentment, the same entitled fury that had led her to send my son out into a hurricane because she was upset with me. Justice had been served, but the real work of healing and moving forward was just beginning. The months following Natalie's sentencing passed in a strange mixture of relief and rebuilding. Dylan and I settled into new routines that didn't include the constant anxiety of wondering when my sister might show up, or what psychological games she might play. For the first time in years, our home felt genuinely peaceful, free from the undercurrent of tension that had characterized so many family interactions. Spring arrived early in Port Clearwater that year, bringing with it the kind of renewal that made everything feel possible again. Dylan threw himself into Little League baseball and marine biology club at school, his natural curiosity and enthusiasm no longer shadowed by the fear of disappointing adults who claimed to love him. His nightmares about storms had gradually faded, replaced by dreams of becoming a marine biologist like his hero, Dr. Sylvia Earle. I watched him flourish with a mixture of pride and protective vigilance that would probably never fully disappear. The trauma of that October day during Hurricane Iris had left marks on both of us, some visible and some hidden, but it had also revealed strengths we hadn't known we possessed. Dylan had discovered his own resilience and voice. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable dangerous behavior, even when it destroys relationships you once thought were unbreakable. The Coast Guard community had rallied around us during the trial and its aftermath, in ways that reinforced my decision to pursue justice. Captain Rivera had made it clear that my actions reflected the values of service and protection that defined our mission. Lieutenant Sophia Garrett had taken on additional responsibilities during the months when legal proceedings consumed much of my attention. The entire station had demonstrated what healthy support looked like, standing by us without enabling harmful behavior or minimizing serious concerns. Dylan's recovery had been remarkable but not without ongoing challenges. Dr. Vasquez continued to monitor his physical health, noting that his experience with hypothermia had left him more sensitive to cold temperatures than other children his age. We developed strategies for managing this sensitivity without letting it limit his activities or create unnecessary fear. More importantly, Dylan learned to trust his own instincts about safety and to speak up when situations felt dangerous or uncomfortable. The psychological healing took longer and required more intentional effort. Dylan had started seeing a child psychologist, Dr. Michael Torres, who specialized in trauma recovery and family dysfunction. Dr. Torres helped Dylan understand that adults sometimes make terrible choices that hurt children, but that these choices reflect the adult's problems rather than anything wrong with the child. He learned vocabulary for describing his feelings and boundaries, for protecting his emotional well-being. One of the most significant developments was Dylan's growing understanding of justice and personal responsibility. He asked thoughtful questions about why Natalie had been sent to prison, whether she would change while she was there, and what would happen if she tried to contact us after her release. These conversations were difficult but necessary, helping him develop a framework for understanding complex moral situations. "Mom, do you think Aunt Natalie knows she did something wrong now?" Dylan asked one evening as we walked along the harbor after his baseball practice. The question required careful consideration. I wanted to be honest without destroying his ability to believe in redemption and positive change. "I think she understands that there were consequences for her choices, but I'm not sure she understands why those choices were wrong. Sometimes adults get so focused on being right that they can't see how their actions affect other people." Dylan nodded thoughtfully, then surprised me with his next observation. "I hope she figures it out someday, but I don't want her to practice on me anymore." His wisdom and emotional maturity at 9 years old continued to amaze me. He'd learned to separate his desire for Natalie's well-being from his need for protection from her behavior. It was a sophisticated understanding that many adults struggled to achieve. The Federal Bureau of Prisons had assigned Natalie to a facility in Ohio, far enough away to ensure she couldn't maintain local connections or influence, but close enough for our mother to visit if she chose. Grace Morgan had struggled with the reality of her daughter's incarceration, alternating between anger at me for pursuing charges and gradual acceptance that Natalie's actions had been indefensible. Mom's journey toward understanding had been slow and painful, marked by difficult conversations and honest reckonings with family patterns she'd previously ignored or minimized. She'd started seeing her own therapist to process the guilt and confusion surrounding Natalie's conviction. Slowly, she began acknowledging that her desire to maintain family harmony had sometimes enabled harmful behavior. "Victoria, I need to apologize to you and Dylan," Mom said during a phone call 6 months after the sentencing. "I was so focused on protecting Natalie that I forgot my responsibility to protect my grandson. I failed both of you by minimizing what was happening." The apology was meaningful but also marked the beginning of a long rebuilding process. Trust, once broken by the choice to prioritize an abuser's comfort over a victim's safety, required consistent actions over time to repair. Mom began making those efforts, listening more carefully when Dylan talked about his experiences and supporting my decisions as his parent without second-guessing or undermining. Meanwhile, the broader community had taken notice of our case in ways that extended beyond local media coverage. Child advocacy organizations began using Natalie's prosecution as an example of how the justice system could work when victims had resources and support. The federal charges had sent a message that child endangerment during emergencies would be taken seriously, regardless of family relationships or excuses about good intentions. I received invitations to speak at conferences about child protection, emergency preparedness, and the intersection of family dynamics with legal accountability. These opportunities allowed me to share lessons learned from our experience, while helping other families recognize warning signs and understand their options for seeking protection. One of the most impactful speaking engagements was at a Coast Guard training seminar on recognizing child abuse among military families. The unique stresses of military life, including deployments, relocations, and demanding schedules, could create situations where children became vulnerable to abuse from family members or caregivers. My story illustrated how even dedicated service members could miss signs of endangerment and the importance of trusting professional assessments over family loyalty. The hardest part wasn't recognizing that Dylan had been hurt, I told the assembled Coast Guard personnel. The hardest part was accepting that someone I loved and trusted had deliberately chosen to hurt him. We're trained to assess threats and respond to emergencies, but family members who abuse children rely on our emotional connections to cloud our professional judgment. The response to these presentations was overwhelmingly positive, with many audience members sharing their own experiences or expressing gratitude for permission to prioritize child safety over family harmony. It became clear that our story was resonating because it addressed conflicts that many families faced, but few discussed openly. Dylan occasionally accompanied me to age-appropriate speaking events, sharing his perspective on recovery and resilience, with remarkable poise and insight. He talked about the importance of adults believing children when they report feeling unsafe, the difference between tough love and cruelty, and his hope that other kids wouldn't have to experience what he'd been through. Sometimes adults think they're helping kids by making them do scary things, Dylan told a group of elementary school counselors. But really helping means keeping kids safe and listening when they say something is wrong. His presentations were powerful partly because of his youth and authenticity, but also because he represented successful recovery from trauma. He showed audiences that children could heal from abuse while maintaining their capacity for trust, joy, and healthy relationships. As Natalie's first year in federal prison progressed, we received occasional updates through the legal system about her progress in mandated counseling programs. The reports were mixed. She was complying with requirements and participating in classes, but staff noted her continued resistance to accepting full responsibility for her actions. She portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances and family dynamics, rather than someone who had made deliberate choices to endanger a child. Dr. Torres helped Dylan understand these reports in age-appropriate terms, explaining that some people needed much longer to learn from their mistakes than others. He emphasized that Dylan's healing didn't depend on Natalie's progress, and that he could hope for her improvement while protecting himself from her harmful behaviors. The protective order requiring Natalie to have no contact with Dylan or me would remain in effect throughout her incarceration and supervised release. This legal barrier provided crucial protection and peace of mind, ensuring that she couldn't attempt to manipulate or intimidate us while serving her sentence. 2 years after the trial, I was promoted to captain and transferred to a position at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. The promotion represented recognition of my leadership during challenging circumstances and opened new opportunities for influencing policy related to emergency response and child protection. Dylan adapted to the move with characteristic resilience, excited about exploring a new city and the educational opportunities it offered. Our new life in the nation's capital brought fresh perspectives and experiences, while maintaining the stability and security we'd worked so hard to build. Dylan joined the Smithsonian's Youth Environmental Alliance and continued his marine biology studies through weekend programs at the National Aquarium. I found meaningful work developing protocols for protecting vulnerable populations during natural disasters, drawing on lessons learned from Hurricane Iris and its aftermath. The distance from Maine and the painful memories associated with our former home was healing for both of us. We could honor what we'd survived while embracing new possibilities for growth and contribution. Dylan's room in our new house overlooked the Potomac River, and he spent hours watching boats and planning his future career in marine conservation. Mom, when first become a marine biologist, I want to study how climate change affects storm patterns, Dylan announced one evening as we watched the sunset over the water. Maybe I can help predict when hurricanes will be really dangerous so other kids don't get hurt like I did. His desire to transform his trauma into service for others represented the ultimate victory over Natalie's attempts to diminish his spirit and confidence. She had tried to teach him that his feelings didn't matter, that his safety was less important than adult convenience, and that speaking up about mistreatment would only bring more problems. Instead, he had learned that his voice mattered, that adults were responsible for protecting children, and that justice was possible, even when it required difficult choices. 3 years into Natalie's sentence, we received notification that she had been transferred to a halfway house in preparation for eventual release. The news triggered some anxiety, but it also prompted important conversations about boundaries, safety planning, and the ongoing protections that would remain in place. Dr. Torres helped Dylan process his feelings about his aunt's gradual return to society while reinforcing his right to choose whether and how to have any relationship with her in the future. Dylan, you don't owe anyone forgiveness or reconciliation, Dr. Torres explained during one of their sessions. Those are gifts you can choose to give if and when you feel ready, but they're not obligations. Your first responsibility is to yourself and your own well-being. This message was particularly important because well-meaning family members and community members sometimes pressured abuse survivors to forgive their abusers as part of healing. Dr. Torres helped Dylan understand that healing was possible with or without forgiveness, and that he could wish someone well while maintaining appropriate distance and boundaries. As Dylan entered middle school, he continued to thrive academically and socially, developing friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligations or adult manipulation. His teachers described him as empathetic and confident, someone who stood up for classmates who were being bullied and showed natural leadership qualities. The trauma he'd experienced had shaped him, but not defined him, contributing to his sensitivity and moral clarity without overwhelming his capacity for joy and connection. I watched him grow with gratitude for his resilience and determination to protect other children from similar experiences. He volunteered with younger students in marine biology programs, mentored kids who were struggling with family problems, and participated in community service projects focused on disaster preparedness and child safety. Kids should never have to worry about adults hurting them on purpose, Dylan told a group of elementary students during a presentation about weather safety. And if it happens to you, it's not your fault, and there are grown-ups who will help you be safe. His message was simple but profound, reflecting lessons learned through painful experience and transformed into wisdom he could share with others. He had become living proof that children could survive abuse, speak truth to power, and grow into adults who protected rather than harmed vulnerable people. By the time Dylan turned 12, Natalie had been released to supervised probation, but remained prohibited from contacting us. The protective order would stay in effect for the duration of her supervised release, providing continued legal protection while she readjusted to life outside prison. Reports from her probation officer indicated that she was living quietly in Ohio, working at a warehouse job, and attending required counseling sessions. Dylan was aware of these developments but not preoccupied by them. He had built a full life centered on his own interests, relationships, and goals, rather than the family trauma that had once threatened to define his childhood. He was preparing for high school, with plans to focus on advanced science courses and environmental advocacy. His future stretched ahead bright with possibility, unmarked by the limitations Natalie had tried to impose through fear and manipulation. Standing in our kitchen one morning as Dylan prepared for another day of 7th grade, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point of peace and stability. The decision to hold Natalie accountable had cost us relationships and caused tremendous pain, but it had also saved Dylan's childhood, and possibly his life. He had learned that adults who truly loved him would protect rather than endanger him, and that his safety and well-being mattered more than anyone's comfort or convenience. The morning sunlight streaming through our windows felt like a promise of continued healing and growth. Dylan finished his breakfast, grabbed his backpack full of science projects and homework, and headed off to school with the confidence of a child who knew he was valued and protected. That confidence was the greatest victory of all, proof that justice and love could triumph over manipulation and abuse when people were willing to fight for what was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.